Next up, we have the shortest title, yet packed with so much deep thinking and so much great thought that's come out of this. I'd like to introduce Carryn Mills. The topic of whose thesis is Becoming Mindful.
I'm not just running away. Here. Okay. I too am going to turn my timer on. All right. Well, I think first of all, I should start by saying that I am just incredibly grateful to be standing here. And I know that that is because of every single person in this room. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but I want to start with just an immense sense of gratitude because that's where I'm coming from, so thank you. After 2 years of studying yoga, I realized that it's all stories, and it's truly those stories that come to matter. In researching mindfulness and seeking to understand if mindfulness was actually being mindful in the many spaces that claim themselves to be just that, I found that it was actually an exploration into self, as much as it was an investigation into mindfulness. As I wrote in my thesis, what began as an investigation into mindfulness and the limitations of scholarship and practice surrounding it became an exploration of the broad-reaching implications of the intersecting processes and value systems that underpin them. This was not something limited to the pages of books. It was actively being written into the fabric of our interwoven experience as interdependent beings. Therefore, to begin to tell this story tonight begins with my conclusions. The many points that I came to after moving through the at times painful and arduous process of my thesis, Becoming Mindful. I approached this study as one of process, where everything operates as cycles, mediated through my Buddhist understanding of myself and life, where the emptiness of shunyata forms the groundless foundation where my sense of anatta, or no-self, comes to know itself via the process of pratitya samutpada, or dependent origination. I attempted multiple times to share that process because throughout my investigation into mindfulness, my understanding that all we are is process was reaffirmed. I wanted to share my understanding of our pointlessness with everyone because it is where I believe we find our liberation. But every time I tried to make that point, I would do so, thereby reaffirming that there wasn't one. This was frustrating, because although I was trying to communicate through emptiness, my hope was not to be self-negating, but rather to share the rich potential of anatta, shunyata, and pratitya samutpada as they form the foundations of being mindful and practicing mindfulness. These were the core conclusions I reached as they formed the structures that allow mindfulness to be mindful of itself, setting the stage for what is effective or potentially engaged mindfulness. I cannot take you through the process that got me here to this point, as that process is me and is forever in motion. I can, however, highlight the narrative frames that support that continued creation and destruction I saw operating within mindfulness, hopefully helping us all become a bit more mindful. The only way I can do this, though, is through myself, which brings me here with you and this point where we will explore our subjectivity in search of objective understanding. Here is the point on the page. What defines the point is that it's not the page. If we look to the point for some intrinsic meaning, we understand that it is not merely as it is. It can only exist because the page is there, otherwise there would be no place for the point. And the only time that the point is existing is now, because I put it on the page, which means that I define the point. And it's not just I that define the point, but everyone in the audience defines the point because you see it as well. But it is also dependent, so it's dependent on all of you, but it's also dependent on the marker and the paper and every other intersecting set of processes that have met to create this singular moment and this very dot, which both is and is not. This suggests that the point, the subject that we are studying, in this case, mindfulness, is highly subjective, existing as the intersection of multiple interlocking loops of processes rather than some concrete knowable product. This is true not only for the dot, but for the chair, the room, and even us. We are the stories we tell. We are not constant. Rather, we are a combination of intersecting processes, a unique set of stories that meet to make us, from our cells to our organ systems, through our memories, experiences, and thoughts. We both are and are not. It is from this story, the point of processes that define me, that I approach studying mindfulness. Being self-reflective, I worked to emplace myself within the research, operating as mindfully as I could. I applied what appears to be missing in some of the mindful yoga spaces. I see this, I cheated, I wrote it beforehand. I see this as the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail, simultaneously sustaining itself as it implies its own destruction. I applied this concept believing that if the mindfulness practices I had were capable of seeing themselves, then I could witness process and better unpack its functioning within the yoga circles that I ran. This would then allow me a greater understanding of how mindfulness was or was not functioning without essentializing the experiences of others. Sure enough, in this transformational experience of investigating mindfulness through it, I was able to expose some of the forces that I believe have shaped and continue to shape Buddhism, mindfulness, and the self. The three key points of intersection that I investigated, you're going to see momentarily where my gazillion processes were before I got there. A little diagram. So the three key points of intersection that I investigated were yoga and mindfulness, mindfulness and Buddhism, and self, no self, and collective selves, moving from the more diffuse to more central focus of mindfulness. Through this navigation, I uncovered a number of narrative frames that functioned as the through lines, or the threads that these points have in common. I found the frames of Western and modernism and resultant postmodernism operating in the conceptualizations and experiences that were shaping the self, or selves, who were then defining and redefining mindfulness, its practice, and its dissemination. Influenced by the Enlightenment, the Protestant Reformation, scientific materialism, rationalism, romanticism, and transcendentalism, these narrative frames were generally characterized by a sense of self that is independent, scientific, rational, capitalistic, secular, as defined by Judeo-Christian belief systems and traditions, as well as patriarchal and potentially representative of white normativity and colonial frames. At any given point, multiple frames are operating at once, especially when experiences of mindfulness, Buddhism, and self are not limited to temples, classrooms, books, or yoga studios, but present in all aspects of our lives, including social, political, and economic. In studying the mutual relationship of mindfulness and these frames of knowing, I found that the element that all these narratives shared was that they were self-sustaining, meaning that they continue to repeat themselves if they remain unacknowledged, supported and strengthened unconsciously by unacknowledged patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting that were being allowed to grow. Mindfulness as a focused, non-oppositional practice of witnessing or remembering can shed a light on these patterns, allowing them to unravel themselves. But if mindfulness lacks emplacement, I found it was more mindless than mindful. The main way I found this operating was through white normativity, where positional superiority is supported by discursive power within an education system whose inequities mirror socioeconomic disparities. white hegemony was functioning not only in scholarship surrounding Buddhism and mindfulness, but significantly through the practice and dissemination, especially through popular media. As we have seen, we are all the stories we tell. But what if we fail to see the stories? I chose to present this material in real time and relationally with the hopes of reflecting a bit of how I learned what I did about mindfulness. But part of what I hope to reflect are the many ways in which we are impacted by elements that we may not immediately understand as influencing us, especially when they have been normalized. And I don't think it's on the, oh maybe. Oh, okay. Yeah. So, here are some of examples that throughout my research I collected. So they were magazine ads or Instagram ads or things you found in random yoga studios, and you'll start to see, I'm going to flip through them a little quickly here. So here are some of the examples of some of the seemingly innocuous ways we learn about what mindfulness is. These images shape our construct, that it's this practice of well-being, it's connected to yoga, it's healthy, it's approachable, it's about self-care, it makes us feel better, it sells things. But really, who are these people? If I flip back through it, you'll notice that most of them are women, and most of them are white, like commercial yoga. So, this last example here, as it says, mindfulness will build bridges and break down walls, begs the question, can mindfulness really build bridges and break down walls? I believe that this is dependent on mindfulness becoming mindful of itself, which means that those engaging mindfulness must be able to see and be present with their sense of self. This meant me seeing myself. If I fail to see myself, including the secular, independent, rational, scientific, and patriarchal shape of the mind frames characteristic of my Western sense of self, then I am missing out on some of the foundations that formulate me and everything around me. The Western sense of self seeks to improve itself, becoming more concrete and battling away the inner sense of lack, driven by the inability to attach to anything constant. When mindfulness techniques are applied to a self that seeks its own affirmation, it can become an act of narcissism and violence, where ineffective patterns of operation are rehearsed, and the I, or ego, is bolstered as it becomes more isolated, capable of ignoring the suffering of others, all the while calling itself mindful. I see this happening in some of the mindful yoga spaces, where rather homogeneous groups of white women are fixated on inner healing and growth, and therefore fail to see that they are supporting a dysfunctional self that supports an inner sense of lack and disassociation. The Western sense of self, as rational, scientific, and separate, runs counter to our engagement with life, where we are constantly interacting in a relational world and where many of our experiences defy rational explanation. Focusing on healing the self through the mind, a hierarchical mind-body dualism is reaffirmed and causes an internal dissonance. It also concretizes a fractured self. When we practice mindfulness that allows for focused awareness on not only what we see, but also what does the seeing, understanding how it operates, we become mindful of our constructed self and our creative self. When we stop hating or denying parts of ourselves, we stop hating and denying parts of someone else. Capable of non-judgmentally holding multiple competing narratives at once, we allow for the diversity of experience and being that is reflective of our complex inner and outer world. Studying mindfulness, I found that insidious dynamics of power, privilege, violence, and oppression can and will continue to operate if they remain unacknowledged. To address the structures functioning around us, we must address their working within us. In attempting to practice mindful mindfulness, I have pointed to the emptiness at the core of my being. More significantly, though, I have uncovered a thick thread that is woven into my story and many similar stories within the contemporary world of yoga and mindfulness. White hegemony will continue to manifest through me if I allow it to penetrate my language, my thinking, and my engagement with life. It remains if I refuse to see it. Effective, engaged mindfulness means not remaining blind to the suffering of others within a system that prizes a select few and demonizes all others. To shift these systems of violence and oppression necessitates remaining vigilant and open, willing to continually be awoken to my positionality. I must see the place I take up and work hard to dismantle the structures in place that I benefit from. I am full of uncertainty, wary of doing it wrong, and afraid of failure. But I know that the greatest failure would be to turn back now, to hide in the comfort of what I know. I believe that this unknown is the creative and destructive space of emptiness. It is potential and constructive personal strength, the ground of groundlessness that mindfulness can cultivate. It is here that we continue to become mindful.
Love you, Carryn.
I did have a heart at the very last flip over. I turned to Morgan and said, "What do I write next?" She says, "Tell him you love him."
Wow.
So when are you leading your first workshop at Mindfulness Center?
Ooh, I think that there's a lot of, finding ground in that groundlessness that's taking place. So let's say soon. Yeah, Chris.
So I wonder if you could share a little bit about your Cuenca retreat and
Sure.
immersion into mindfulness.
Well, I actually addressed that in my thesis. I went and did a Vipassana retreat as part of my research and part of my, human experience and or experience of the transcendent, perhaps. And we broke silence on the second, the very last day. And I hadn't spoken to my roommate at all, and my roommate happened to be Black. And we got into a very honest conversation about race. And one of the fascinating things that she shared with me was that because she had grown up in the Netherlands, she was sort of, her experience of race in America was sort of separate, but still really part of it. She lived here for a few years. So she was able to sort of look at it from multiple different angles. And one of the things that I share in my thesis is another participant who she was speaking to, she said, "Oh, I'm from the Netherlands." She said, "Oh, I assumed you were from the South." Right? So she shared with me, and I think it's crazy to be at this space where we're building a sense of mindfulness or concentration, right? And that was this person's sense of, it was a slip of the tongue, right? But it's really not. That's someone's experience and identity, and you've just written that for another person. Do you understand the weight of what you just said? And she approached even talking about it with such incredible, just strength. And one of the things she sort of said to me was kind of feel a little bad for white people because look at us go. And look at you guys, and she was, I think she was really saying, I think that runs the risk of essentializing and participating in the same role you don't want to be participating in, but there's a truth in that, which is to say, if you base your sense of power or strength on, being at the top, there can't be that many people at the top, right? And so you want to keep that sort of sense of, no, this is the sort of normative, this is normal, but it's not normal, right? It's suffering that we see all around us, and until we choose to acknowledge that maybe part of the ways we operate, even, not consciously, are affecting others in every, decision you make, right? Then you understand that you are part of the narrative because you're alive.
Yeah, so I have a question. So having that opportunity to have been brought up both in India and here, I think you're a little too hard on people in this country, because back in India now, even though it's the land of yoga, there's a lot of emphasis now on gyms and getting fit, and it's a little bit of an obsession. So as far as mindfulness goes, isn't mindfulness more of a subjective thing than rather than just a cultural or a quantified by nation status? Isn't it more of what we as individuals want to become mindful for?
I think the answer to that question is like yes and no. One of the things that made it really challenging to ever talk about this was that it is so subjective, especially something like mindfulness. But it depends on who you ask, because some people would tell you, no, that mindfulness is it's a core Buddhist tradition, and it looks these ways. And I read so many different approaches to how it's understood, and there's the mindfulness movement, and there are people saying that it's secular, there are people saying it's religious, and instead of trying to say it was one thing or another, I tried to see how it functioned, and I addressed that through my own subjectivity. I used other studies, so I used some scholars who are both practitioners and scholars, we're sort of like bridging both of those edges, and I tried not to sort of dualize, but it's very hard to speak in language without dualizing. But yeah, I think that, to be mindful is, in my experience, and I think that there's a key element of that remembering, which is it's not just these sort of sensations or flows that keep moving, it's how you engage them or you don't engage them. And the better able you are to sort of take that step back and see them all functioning at once, you might start to notice that there's still some attachment to, right? Like the more you're able to sort of be aware of the directions it's moving in, the more you can be centered in something that's shared.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What do you think causes people these days in the mainstream to begin entering mindfulness?
I think that there's a lot, based on the lifestyle that a lot of us are living in, sort of this sort of Western context of everything moving faster, and I think that a lot of people are experiencing a dissonance. You're being told you understand yourself one way, and I think that is based on sort of unacknowledged conceptualizations of self that we live through, and then that forms us. But I think that we all have our own experience of trauma and pain, and no one wants that denied of themselves, but how do we engage it effectively so that we move through it, as opposed to reinforcing it?
Yeah.
And yeah, we don't have a lot of effective ways of doing that, aside from sort of ones that are sort of more palliative, which is like, doesn't really address the root cause of it.
Do you think it would be better to start it like in the school system? Do you think it would be a good idea to engage in the corporate system? What do you think would be a good place to start?
Well, I think that question is highly subjective, and I also think it's part of where the problematic question sort of comes up, right? Like, how do you go engage in this? Like, I teach little kids yoga. That was another one of the examples I used in my thesis, which was we were having the conversation about Sanskrit being used in the classroom, and immediately I noticed it broke down along race lines. Like, the two white people in the room were like, we should whatever it means to be in there, we will take away Sanskrit. You don't have to say Om. It's for the tools. This will make it better. And like every other person in the room was like, were people of color, and they were all like, that doesn't feel whole to me. That, and so like in that moment you just see like you're so entrenched in what it is you understand yourself to be, or how you understand yourself to operate. You don't see. So I don't know the question. Yeah, I think it should be in schools, but how do you bring that into schools in a way that isn't, right, asserting a sort of denying someone else's story?
Yep. Good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.